Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is to have Mawi Asgedom as our guest on Conversing today. Mawi and I have known each other for a number of years, and I've been eager to have him as a guest because his personal story as well as his professional work have just been so significant to me. They've influenced the way that I've thought and perceived many things since first meeting him. His journey is one that extends from an Ethiopian refugee camp to a Harvard graduate to becoming a pioneering social entrepreneur who has literally inspired millions, particularly of children, but adults as well. He fled Ethiopia as a child, settled for a while with his family in southern Sudan, and by the good graces of World Relief, found an opportunity to come to the United States with his family when he was just about to begin first grade. He goes on in his education and in his athleticism and in so many areas to become a very, very high achiever, but in the process continues to suffer challenges, suffering of a very significant kind. Graduates ultimately from Harvard, gives the commencement address before 30,000 people, goes on to found a social emotional learning company that's evidence-based and that is addressing some of the greatest social emotional development challenges of children. I'm so excited about his new venture, which we're going to hear about as well, so I can't wait to welcome him. Mawi, I have such joy today in having you as my guest on Conversing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Mark, it's a great honor. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I can't wait for our conversation.
You know, you are the holder of what feels to me like oceans of life and oceans of the world in so many significant ways. I want to be sure that along the way we have a chance for you to tell at least some of your background story, which really does, like all of us, it shapes us, but your story in particular is a story that I think is extremely important for people to hear and understand. But I also think it's a story that in one sense, as listeners will soon hear, is a story of challenge and struggle and pain and suffering. On the other hand, it's a story of God's faithfulness, of your resilience, of your joy, of your devotion and love and intelligence and hard work. So it's this robust complex of things all held in the body and life of Mawi Asgedom. And it's just such a remarkable thing. So why don't we start with some of your origin story, because that does set the stage for your life as it does for all of us, but certainly your childhood shapes you in very significant ways.
Mark, it's funny you say that. I have a lot of out-of-body experiences where I compare to where I'm living now sometimes, and it's so different, so far away that it doesn't seem like it's me in some ways. It feels very strange sometimes.
I'm sure.
And, I was born in a tiny village called Adwala in Tigray in Ethiopia. And actually, what's amazing thing is on Google Maps now, you can look up any tiny village. So I'll go there and I'll look it up and you can kind of drill in and see like little things. And, I lived there with my mother and my father and I had siblings. I had a brother and sister, and there was a terrible war in that part of the world that actually lasted for 30 years. It was a civil war that eventually created the country now known as Eritrea. And so what happened at that time was in those villages, it's not just the main Ethiopian army fighting against one rebel group. It's 5 or 6 rebel groups all fighting for supremacy against each other. They would not call themselves rebel groups. They'd call themselves independent forces, of course. And it got very dangerous there because one week, one of the groups might come in and say, "We heard you gave food to that group. If that happens again, you're done." And then that group comes in And of course, you're gonna give them food because they have guns, right?
Of course.
There was some other challenges as well with my father. What was his actual title was an advanced dresser of wounds.
Oh my gosh!
Which he had a little certificate from Haile Selassie, the emperor, that he had.
I love that.
But there was no doctors around there. He wasn't even a nurse, so he was delivering babies. He was treating people with snake bite. People would literally show up in front of our home with a mule and say, "We got to ride for 2 days in the hope that you can save my family member." And my father so that meant that the different armed forces also wanted this advanced dresser of wounds to be with them.
Yes.
And so he basically figured out he had to flee or he was gonna die. So he fled to Sudan. And that's one of the things I think is amazing. Sudan is not the safest place in the world, Mark. So if you're fleeing to Sudan, okay?
Let's go to Sudan to find safety is not everyone's slogan. No.
So it's amazing because I believe in not too dissimilar time, there were people from southern Sudan fleeing to southern Ethiopia. So it's not even just like we are fleeing from northern part of Ethiopia to northern Sudan. They're fleeing from southern. So it's really, but he basically told my mom, find your way. Like you're going to have to find your way. And we're not talking about an Amtrak, here's the Amtrak ticket or here's the bus. It's, you're walking a lot of it. I actually was able to Google map the journey. Maybe I can send that to you to upload on your website for your listeners to look at. And so my mom at that point was probably about 20 years old. She had 3 young kids. Her husband is now living in a different country. She doesn't know if he's alive or dead. People are so used to cell phones and those kind of things now. You can easily verify information. You don't know what's happened. You just know he's gone. And some months later, they didn't want people to flee. So it was actually quite difficult to leave. And so we basically snuck out and had to make our way sleeping outside most of the time. The scariest thing my mom tells me about is hyenas. And a lot of people in the US probably don't understand how terrifying it can be because they're pack animals. And they really kill a lot of people in that part of the world, where I think Americans are most likely to think of like lions or like tigers or stuff like that, right? And so my mom goes on this incredible journey where she leads us across. We have camels some of the way. I still vaguely, I'm like 3 or 4. I vaguely remember being on a camel, donkeys, and then we walked a lot of the way. One of the things I'll never forget, Mark, that I saw as a kid was someone walking while their feet were bleeding from kind of the rocks slicing through their feet and that kind of stuff. And you see that people in the States might refer to it as, look at that grit, that determination. If that's what you see as a kid and that's what you know, that's basically what you know, right? Is that sometimes life is really, really hard. It's really, really bad. It's really hard, and it's normal. Like it's not normal, but it's normal. Like nothing like that should not be normal. And so that I'd say kind of gives you a certain kind of like hardness, I would say, like to experience some of that. I see that in some of the a lot of the refugees I know who had to endure a lot of things that were far greater than anything I went through. So we eventually got to Sudan, and then we had to find my father, and it was literally going around saying, "Have you seen Haile Abdi, son of Zedingle? He's from this part," and kind of finding your way. And I consider it a tremendous grace that I was able to reconnect with my father, that we are then able to go to a refugee camp called Msagata. And we had, I remember living in a hut there. So it was, basically refugees congregate in an area in Sudan. There's Sudanese people kind of near you, but you're in your own refugee area. And we had maybe about 200 huts that were made of like straw. It's kind of like mud, straw thatched kind of huts there. No running water. And that was my life before I came to the States. I had never seen snow before. One of the things that people in the States think is a little bit different some of the work I do with schools is there's a little school at the refugee camp. And I remember it was so different than the States. Like literally, they would beat you down, Mark, for not knowing a simple math problem. Like you would get beat. And if you complained and went home and told your mom or dad, they would beat you again. Like it was a very different mindset about respecting the teacher, education, and I was very pleasantly surprised to discover detentions when I came to this country. Oh, this is pretty cool. I just have to sit in a chair and nothing happens. And then I go home.
Nobody's
hey, that's pretty
body.
good.
Oh my gosh. Maui, when all that was unfolding and you're being beaten sometimes in school, what, in retrospect, would you say is your understanding of that kind of approach? Was it just like an instinct that came out of desperation and a feeling of trying to exercise some kind of control in a context in which there was no control? Or how do you understand that as you look back on it? Especially because we're going to come in a moment to talk about your incredibly important work in social and emotional learning. So I'm just curious what your reflections have been about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to answer that. I would say one way to kind of understand it is there's a story of a father who's working with a little kid, his son, and they're hammering. Okay, they have a hammer and nail, and they're working together to build a structure.
Right.
in Ethiopia, right? And the kid is holding the nail and making sure everything's lined up, and the father hits the nail, hits the nail through the son's finger.
Yes,
and the son is bleeding, right? And the father in this story hits the son on the head and says, "Why don't you move your nail out of the way?" And the reason for that is, I try to interpret the story a lot of ways, but the way I interpret it is there's still the same amount of love that a father would have here. It's an unforgiving environment. So if a nail goes through your finger, you're not suing anybody. There's no one to get help from. So you better know how to make sure the nail doesn't go through your finger.
Right.
Even if it's not your fault.
Right.
So it's a different mindset, I would say, about toughness, watching out for oneself. And then in the schools, I would say the idea that the times table, every kid should know the times table because it's laziness to not have memorized it. 2 times 2 is 4. Whereas in the States, you might say, well, this kid's just isn't as good as math, or, he's more of a reading kid, or he'll get to it in 2nd or 3rd grade, or like he had a bad day, forgot, or he had some anxiety. It's a very different mindset around. That's why you see these folks from countries like mine produce so many engineers and things like that. Is we're going to learn the math.
Right.
And that will happen, and everybody will learn the math. And if not, there's a problem. And so I would say looking at it in the States, some of the other experience I've had in the States is I worked a lot of schools where a kid will do something they shouldn't do, and the school will call the parent, and then the parent will say, well, my little Johnny would never do something like that. Like he's a perfect kid.
Right.
Or he's just an independent thinker. Why are you squashing his independent thinking? And so there's pluses and minuses to both approaches. I think the U.S. education could probably benefit from some of the higher expectations around discipline and learning some of the basic things that every child should be expected to learn and being diligent about it. And parents having very strong, universally, support for those things.
Yes.
But at the same time, when you have so much harshness sometimes, like for example, I've never beaten my kids. I was beaten all the time growing up. And that's because I came across some research. And by the way, you're used to doing things the way that you grew up. Like if you were spanked heavily by your father, you're more likely. I came across some research that showed me different ways of doing that, of disciplining my kids, and not resorting to that level of violence.
Right.
Part of the things I think is unfair is I remember when I was getting beat as a kid, I used to think the only reason this is happening is because you're big and I'm small. That's really what it is. It's so unfair. It is so unfair. So I thought, why would I do that to my kid? Okay. The only reason that this is happening really is because I'm big and this kid is small. So it's really like just me exploiting a massive power imbalance. So that's another thought I have too, is that a lot of times when we're being so severe or harsh, it's rooted in a really unfair, in my opinion, power imbalance that long term is going to shift and is not going to teach the kid what they should know. So that's kind of like a long answer for you, but it's a different wiring. Like it's almost like in the States. Another way of thinking about it, Mark, is in the States, where I come from, people expect a lot of bad things to happen. It's just part of how life is. In the States, people get really upset if any bad things happen. Like there's an expectation about kind of like what life is and what can go wrong. That is very different when you've had wars. When you've had wars and had to flee and had different regimes come in and there's been droughts and famine. It's kind of it just wires you a little bit differently, I would say, is kind of how I think about it.
Now, you have this experience in this refugee camp. You're together, at least as a family. You're there for a total of 3 years. And there's so much to tell about this. And as I said at the introduction, this really quite amazing book that you've written called Of Beetles and Angels is a book that recounts this in further detail. We'll put all this in the show notes because it's really so important that I think people have a chance to follow up and read your book. But you eventually, by the good graces of God and world relief, end up being able to come as a family to the United States and in a new chapter, dramatically new chapter, hugely contrasting to the circumstances that you're describing, and yet not easy at all. Even though you've come to America, it's not, of course, the panacea that probably could have been imagined. So tell us a bit about that entry and the challenges there.
Yeah, so, we're living in, as I described, in a small refugee camp in Sudan, have no notion of what California is, of what Illinois is, or any of this stuff. And you don't pick where you go. Like, they just tell you you're going here, right?
Yes,
like based on demographics and where jobs are needed and all those kind of things. And so we found out we were going to Illinois, to outside of Chicago, and eventually landing in Wheaton, which again had no idea what this is, right? Keep in mind, I've never seen snow before. Some kind of like sense-based things that are different. I've never touched snow. Have never had cold cow milk. Have only drank goat milk that was warm, that you literally milk the goat and you drink it, right? Like any eggs you got from the chickens that were right there in the refugee camp that helped us survive. Had not had the experience of these vast supermarkets, right? Certainly had seen some stores and things like that, but not at the level here. I remember just being blown away by how many cars there were. Like in the refugee camp I was in, no one owned a car. Right? Like there was cars that would come by, but you didn't know anybody who owned a car, right? And so we got to Wheaton, and I will say a couple of things, Mark. One on the blessings, and this is really, I think, probably the thing that Americans take the most for granted, is that people mostly think it's the material abundance in this country, but I would say it's safety. Like it's physical safety. When you have come from a war-torn area where people can do mortal harm upon your family, and you're powerless. To go from that, it's not that there's not violence in the U.S. There is violence in the U.S., right? There's all sorts of violence, but it's different. It's not armed groups that are always around that are, recruiting soldiers when they're young and things like that. So I would say that was the biggest psychological relief, is that larger sense of safety. The sense of possibility, even in the refugee camp, my parents told me, hopefully you can go to school there and work and help your family and have opportunity that we could never imagine. They literally told me that. And that is a great hope that a lot of people have been able to realize in the United States. And so you have these kind of things. We were met by world relief at the airport at O'Hare. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known where to go. We literally would not have been able to leave the airport. We didn't have a car. We didn't know anything about getting to any town. My dad spoke what I call negative English. That's where you know enough English to get yourself into trouble, but not enough to help yourself, right? And so it's a lot of. So I'd say the schools were certainly a lot nicer. Though we had indoor plumbing, like that's a big deal, right? On the challenges, Mark, I'd say the big one is one big one that people might not think about is isolation. Like when you're used to a communal way of living, even in a refugee camp, we had each other. And even to the point that there's a saying that some have said of our time in the refugee camp, because we developed such strong bonds with other refugees, which in my language means sweetness passed us by before we called it sweet, which means we had these incredible relationships with these folks. We were respected for our culture. There was a sense of human connection that was very real as we were going through that very difficult experience. We land in Wheaton. We were the only Ethiopian, we were the only Tigrinya speaking family there. Like we were the first ones. This is before the huge wave. And you're not speaking the language. People don't look like you. You don't understand the economy. My mom couldn't drive for 3 years, and my father, he had problems with his vision. So we're in the suburbs. It's important to be able to get around in the wintertime. Like I still remember I had a little bike, and I'd go to the local store. I'd ride my bike there when it's cold out in the wintertime sometimes, and I'd have milk on one handlebar, and then other groceries here, and be riding with all this stuff because we don't have a car. And again, I'll take that hardship over being in a refugee camp, but it's still not
hard,
as nice as it could be in the States, right? I'd say the biggest problem for me on a daily basis was at school. I had some kids call me Black Donkey. I had a bunch of kids tell me to go back to Africa. In my culture, we cook with a lot of onions, a lot of garlic. We don't smell the same way that other kids smell. And we don't know that we're not smelling like they smell. And there's also this sense of being invisible at some point where you're not included in any of the social activities that people of value are included in. I'd say long-term psychologically, that was the most damaging thing from K-12 was over time, if you're I'm not saying it always happens, it happened for me. For a lot of folks who are living in living in a relatively abundant community like Wheaton, where you don't look like other people, and there is a big imbalance in terms of finances and stuff, you develop a sense that you're less than the other people there, that you're inferior to them there, that you don't have as much value, that go ahead and you can be a part of our schools as long as you don't screw it up too bad. But this community is not your community.
Right.
Psychologically, existentially, long-term, that took me quite a long time to be able to step into who I really was and be like, I got nothing to be ashamed of. I am proud of my mom and dad. I'm proud of my background. I'm proud of every part of who I am. It took me a long time to be able to feel that and say that.
I'm sure
I think,
it does. Sure.
I think that was probably the invisible kind of scar from that experience, right?
Now, the golden thread that's wending through this is two things, I think, from what I understand. First, an incredibly tight family, and especially of an exceptionally close relationship with your older brother, Dewolda. And then secondly, your athletics. And thirdly, your exceptionally high academic achievement. So here you are in this environment that you're describing, which sounds really, really difficult. And at the same time, there's this pretty amazing core of being that's kind of in you. It's the family, it's the physical capacity to do well in sports, and it's particularly the academic achievements. So in the middle of what is otherwise this uncomfortable environment, you're also on the rise to become an exceptional achiever. So, which is what ultimately leads you to Harvard. So tell us how those two things interacted as you were a kid.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times people look at my story and they say, wow, that must have been really hard. I tell them, you know what would have been really hard? All these kids you read about, they come by themselves with no mom, no dad, no sibling, no emotional support. I had, it's interesting. I spoke one time at a correctional facility outside of Chicago, and they'd read my book of Beatles and Angels. All these teenagers had read it, and they invited me to come speak. And a kid raised his hand and said, I would switch places with you. I was like, really? And I said, why is that? He goes, I'd rather be a refugee and go through the stuff you went through with a family that I was close to who loved me than to be in this country by myself. And I thought about it, and I was like, this student is correct. The greatest poverty really is a poverty of relationship.
Right.
It's when you have no one. And I had parents who looked at me and said, despite our challenge, said, you can do anything. You can get a scholarship to college. Every single one, you can go to college. And don't ever doubt that. And that's a big deal. My older brother, Twelde, we got beat up together in the refugee camp. We beat kids up together in the refugee camp. Same thing happened in the States. We learned all the American sports. We didn't know what American football was. We didn't know what baseball was. We didn't know any of this stuff. We learned all those sports. We went to school together. And to me, we were like, he was an extension of me. And what really helped a lot, Mark, in terms of all these things coming together, because it took a while, by the way. Like, I also feel bad for the refugees and immigrants who come when they're 16, 17.
Yes.
They only have a year in school. I came in first grade, so I had an opportunity to not do so well. I was an English learner for 3 years, just learning the language. I was in ESL programs. And I had time to go through the maturation process and to evolve. So did my brother. He wasn't always doing so well in these different areas. I had a sense when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, there was an achievement test right when I was coming out of English language learner. I was like, and I had gotten used at some point to wondering if I could do as well. I was like, wow, I just got 99 percentile in everything. And that was the first sense I got that, okay, maybe I'm more intelligent than I thought, right? Maybe that gave me some confidence. A massive turning point in all this coming together, Mark. The biggest turning point in all this was, because we got in trouble in middle school, especially. I was shoplifting with some kids in my area. I was doing some things that I'm ashamed to have done those things, but my brother really started to develop his faith a lot more. He became a leader in our church, small group leader at our church. And I took note. Like, I was very observant of everything my brother did. And I started to be a lot more serious. And then and my parents had always, we read the Bible every weekend together. We were Christians before we came to this country, right?
Yes.
And there was another really cool thing at Wheaton Bible Church in Wheaton. There's a gentleman there named Mark Linz who became my small group leader. And he's a white guy who was born in Ethiopia. Missionary guy. So I'm like, how lucky am I? I got this guy who knows my culture, my background, knows some words of my language, knows all our food, has an instant connection with my family, my parents.
Yes.
And he's my mentor at church. And he was my core group leader for 4 years. He loved basketball. I love basketball. Like, it was awesome. We'd watch all those Bulls games together when the Bulls were killing everybody. It was great. His brother and so that was... When I read in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ Jesus who gives me strength, I believe that, Mark. I believe there's nothing I could do. I don't have to worry about the fact that I live in a Section 8 housing. I don't have to worry about the fact that my father is unemployed, but these other kids in my school, their parents have great jobs. I believe that the creator of the universe loves me. That I am, and that I believe that he has a great plan for my life, and that there's nothing I can't do, and that and there were many very inspirational parts of the Bible that I read very closely in high school. That was the missing kind of ultimate kind of inspiration I needed. And what happened actually, I would run over and grab it. There was a journal that I received working with Mark, and we were supposed to take 5 minutes each day to write about what happened that day. Well, by the time I graduated from high school, I kept my own journals. I had about 10 journals this high.
Wow.
And that was my introduction to this spiritual inner world in a very rich way. And so I would say for me, then a lot of what happens is they say, how do you gain confidence? You gain confidence by becoming more skilled in different areas. So as I became more skilled in my academics and I saw I was doing well, then I became more confident. I started doing even better. As I became more skilled in sports, I saw that I was a really good runner and I practiced more. And so I would say the virtuous cycle of working really hard, seeing that you're getting better, being more confident because you're better, but then being more inspired to work hard. This is what real growth mindset looks like, right? And so that got me to a point my senior year where I couldn't believe when, I got those admission packets from Harvard, from Yale, from all the schools I applied to, and with a lot of financial aid. I would have been very happy going to University of Illinois, which is a fantastic school that we have here. Our flag. In all this, Mark, probably the thing that, you didn't ask about it, but I'll bring it up. The biggest challenge I've faced in my life, in terms of just like my human experience, like the thing that rocked me the most, was in my sophomore year. My older brother, Twelde, went to over the Christmas break. He was a senior, I was a sophomore. He went to visit an old Sunday school teacher that he was close to in Montana. Him and a friend went driving, and in South Dakota, a drunk driver came on the road, slammed into my brother's car, killed my brother instantly, and also the guy who was right next to him had to be helicoptered out. I was actually at our church when that happened at a sleepover, and this gentleman I told you about, Mark, had the horrific task of telling me that my brother was, and it was this terrible out-of-body experience that I'll never forget, Mark, and I knew my life was going to be different forever. As soon as it happened. Before, when he was alive, I could always count on him to kind of like break the wind. And after that, it was really like, wow, I knew in my soul instinctively that it was basically like a make or break moment for myself, for my family. And I do believe in the concept of spiritual and life momentum, Mark, that if you have enough positive momentum, even in these horrific, unimaginable, devastating challenges, you basically, like, as they say, when you face these challenges, you don't create new habits, you fall back on what you're already doing. So
Yes.
I was already working hard on my classes, I kept doing that. I was already, journaling about my faith, I kept doing that. I was already, and those kind of carried me through for about the next year and a half of anguish. And I still think about my brother all the time. My 3 boys have his name as their middle name to this day. So I think about him
wonderful.
all the time. But it also, when you're talking about hope, Mark, what I learned is that out of the greatest misery and the most devastating loss can come unimagined growth. And in some cases, joy and happiness. One of the mental limitations I used to put on myself was I would say, well, I'm never going to have a relationship or friendship as close to the one I had with my brother. And I mentioned that to somebody one time. They were like, well, that's a stupid way to live. And they're right. That is a stupid way to live. It's not a comparison thing. I have God bless me with a wonderful relationship with my wife now. I get to be a dad to these wonderful kids. I've been blessed to know other people and to build. And I think part of my own maturation, Mark, was understanding that while that loss is still great and devastating to me, God still gives me the opportunity to have many wonderful relationships in my life, and I should step into that with courage and with joy. That was one of the things I had to learn in my early 20s and to kind of like accept as I was still bruised from that loss, right?
Right. I do want to say for listeners that you tell the story of your close relationship to your brother of Beatles and Angels, and it makes even more profound sense of the depth of the agony, but also the quite remarkable degree of healing, learning, recovery, eventually, never the loss that isn't still remembered and grieved, but your capacity and God's grace to help you move into that and through that to new relationships or deeper relationships with people that you've known without in the slightest bit letting go of your relationship with your brother, which will always be so defining.
Definitely. If I could add 2 things to that, Mark, real quick. One is I chose to view it as some people never have a relationship like this, an older brother. God gave me this incredible gift. For 16 years, I had someone I was so close to who taught me we had so many fun times, and I learned so many things that I can carry forward. Another thought I had in my head is, as Christians, we believe we will see our loved ones again. And that is a great comfort and joy, and it was to me, and it still is. And then finally, just in terms of my relationship with him, I knew nothing would be more disappointing to him than if I gave up at that time, and nothing would honor him more than if I aspired to do some of the things he taught me. So I think these are all ways of saying what you're saying, which is how can we find ways to take these devastating things and find joy and happiness out of them when otherwise, when you look at it, it's very easy just to see the loss every second and nothing but loss,
Right.
Because it's so painful. That's something all human beings can relate to at some level because we all suffer loss in our lives.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. Maui, you do end up going to Harvard, and in the end, it becomes a positive, life-shaping experience. But of course, the continued contrast between Ethiopia and Sudan to Wheaton, and then you make another gigantic cultural move to be at Harvard. And there's a beautiful place in your writing where you've expressed the shock, really, in contrasting your childhood with your own children, who at the moment that you're describing are talking about playing in Harvard Yard, and it's a place that you belong to and that you celebrate, and yet it wasn't all easy by any means. I want to hear about that, and then I want us to move to talking about what actually comes beyond that. So please tell us a little bit more, and particularly, I am sure that you've conveyed this in other places, but tell people a bit about the faith challenges and journey that you went through when you were at Harvard as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I'm about to go to next week I'm going to go to my 25th reunion at Harvard, right?
Nice.
And I'll be there on
And
campus.
I do believe
and
you're wearing crimson today, just for
That's
the record.
it. That's it, right? Make note, my classmates. And I think it's so amazing that my mom didn't get a chance to go to school at all. And for my kids, for my son Sawyer and daughter Bryn, this is going to be, I think, their third Harvard reunion where they're just sleeping in the Harvard dorms. That is such a massive gulf from no access to school to I'm in, refugee camp at that age to it's normal for them, like to, oh yeah, when we go to Harvard reunion. So it is pretty astounding to me when I think about that. So Mark, it's interesting. The first year at Harvard, actually, when I was in Wheaton, I had to do everything for my family. I was doing the translations. I was working extra to make money there. Any form I had to read. I'd have to, when I got to Harvard, all I got to do is go to these classes. I was a humanities major, so you're only going 12 hours a week. High school, I feel sorry for these high school kids. They're basically trapped in the building from 8 to 3:30. Right. They can't leave. A lot of college students, if you're not an engineer or pre-med person, and I was a history major, you're in class 12 hours a week.
Right.
My food is all taken care of.
Right.
I'm living in a pretty nice dorm. I'm hanging out with my classmates. I'm playing basketball 5 times a week, 2 hours with people I love. It's pretty good, okay? I'm having all these, it was awesome. I was on the Harvard African Association. Now I'm hanging out with all these international kids from Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana. I'm sure it's some of the cool things that Fuller is able to offer. Is like for an international person to be able to connect with all these people from around the world. I loved every second of that.
Yes,
that freshman year was like, wow, I got this. And of course, that's when you're about to have the worst experience, right? That's maybe like whenever you think you're on top, you should be afraid. Be afraid. Something bad's about to happen, right? So I have this I remember there was a professor, I took a sociology class my first year, and the professor, I'm not making this up, he asks, how many of you here, about 40 of us, are Christians? I raised my hand, it was about 5 of us. And he goes, by the time you graduate, none of you will be Christians. He said that, which I thought was very inappropriate for a professor to say, by the way. I thought that was kind of a vicious thing to say to an 18-year-old, in my opinion, who's just there to learn about something else. But for him to say that, I thought was, and I was really, I'm very strong in my faith. Just ignore that guy. I'm going to get my class done and forget this guy, okay? Then I still remember one of the most shocking moments in my life. It was so shocking to me, Mark. I woke up, I think it was my second day of my sophomore year, in my room, and I realized something. I didn't believe in God anymore. And it was a shocking existential moment. One way to think about it is, it was a different way. Losing Jesus was a different version of losing my brother. That's how close, when you're a true follower of Christ and you are connected to Christ and you pray every day, read the word every day, and you put your faith in him, it's not a small loss. It's a massive loss.
Massive.
One way to think about it is that imagine you've been told, hey, you're about to play the most important basketball game of your life. But you show up to play, you're really excited, you got your warm-ups on and everything. You show up, and instead of referees, there's ostriches. Instead of a basketball court, now you have a swimming pool. And instead of a basketball, you see 2 hippos in there or something. And you don't even know what the rules are or what the game is. Having one's faith and worldview kind of torn apart, and suddenly it may not seem like a big deal to someone who hasn't experienced it, but it was really, I was thinking thoughts like this. Right. I would literally look at the table in my room and think, I'm just a bunch of random atoms, like that table, that wood. So it doesn't even matter if I'm alive or dead, because it doesn't matter if that wood is alive or dead. So I'd have these horrific, terrible, depressing thoughts that I couldn't get out of my head.
Right.
And I would think them everywhere, like it was crushing to me. There was a hopelessness that I felt, Mark, and then at the same time, I suffered some relationship challenges where some of my very good friends were either put far away in dorms randomly, or they were gone for whatever reason. About 12, I find that when we go to our worst challenges, Mark, it's not because one bad thing happened. It's usually like 8 or 9. Like most of us have the capacity to handle like one bad thing happen. But when it's like 8 or 9 all at once and it keeps building on each other, then you don't even realize that it's 8 or 9 at that point. It's just you're caught up in this mental thing. So I'd say it was devastating. And that sophomore year, it's one of the reasons I would later get in the field of youth development was I developed tremendous empathy for people. I didn't realize it then. I was depressed that whole year.
Yes.
It was like a lost year in my life. I was just going through the motions. And in my soul, instinctively, there's been a lot of times, Mark, where I've felt something in my soul. And I was like, you got to really listen to that voice. It just told me, get out of Harvard, go somewhere else. And back then, nobody studied abroad. Like now, a lot of people do. Their study abroad department for the entire campus of 8,000 students, 7,000 students was just one woman, and she was in charge for all the 80 countries, and no one did it. Maybe like 10 of my classmates did it, or 20 of my classmates out of 1,600 my year. I studied abroad in Spain, and that was really a godsend for me because I think sometimes we have to be removed from an environment. There is no other way. Like I needed to go somewhere else. Right. And I needed to experience different things, travel, take classes in Spanish, marvel at things, and enjoy things. And then the cool part is I actually have this interesting thing, Mark, I've seen happen in my life again and again and again, which is I'll suffer a horrific kind of challenge I didn't see coming, like my brother passing away or losing my faith. And then about 2 years later, there's some unimagined incredible growth. Like I get into Harvard. In this case, I come back to my senior year and actually a lot of my relationships were better off than I thought. I have done a lot better academically than I gave myself credit for. Like I get a bunch of different awards from the university. I end up giving the commencement speech. All these kind of really fun things. I get a fellowship that just one kid, you don't apply for it, they just give it to you. They give it to one kid in the whole class for $8,000 that I use to start my next business. Like this really prestigious gift that one kid gets, one senior gets. And then with my faith, Mark, I was hoping there'd be an easy button where, cool, just like I woke up one day, I'm gonna wake up one day, it's gonna be all fixed. I would say it took me about 8 or 9 years of kind of thinking, reflecting. Some of the things that really bothered me when I was at Harvard was I see all these Jewish kids who are awesome. I see all these Muslim kids who are awesome. I see all these Confucian kids who are awesome. When you come from a place like Wheaton, they're all going to hell. 100%. Every last one of them, forever. Okay? They're going to burn in the fires of hell.
Right.
It didn't make sense to me. I couldn't believe it because I'm like, some of these guys believe what they believe just because of where they were born. Right. You tell me some kid in Bangladesh right now that lived at age 7 who was maybe couldn't hear because he was born with physical ailments and just even if he could, he never heard the word Jesus. He's going to go to hell for that. For me, anyone listening to this, you think what you want. For me, I could not believe that. And I still don't believe that. And what I had to come to see, Mark, was in the kind of faith that was cemented in Wheaton was a faith where you either knew everything or you knew nothing. Mm-hmm. There was no room for doubt, like no room for doubt. And the way, and the faith that I came to develop that is a part of my faith now is rooted in doubt. It's rooted in the idea that there's so much I don't know. Yes. And yet I choose to have faith in Jesus.
Yes.
And it's not a weakness that I don't know everything. It's not, I'm less concerned about who's going to heaven or who's going to hell, quite frankly. Like not that I don't want to share the gospel, but that's not my primary lens for understanding what Christianity is. But it took me 8 or 9 years to figure this out. And there was a lot of suffering and there was a lot of mental anguish. And and so that was my faith journey. And if I could say anything to Christians, I actually gave a speech that was not well received in Wheaton. When I was 23, I was invited to speak to a men's group. And I shared my journey and I said, hey, if we want our kids to have their faith, we got to teach them how to doubt as a part of faith. And that's basically the key missing ingredient. If we want them to live in this world, we can't just hide from the world, right? And I believe that that's critical for our next generation. I know Fuller does a lot of work on understanding the next generation and making sure that we're connecting with the next generation. I believe that that's got to be a core part of it, in my opinion, Mark.
Right. I've been working for many years on a book that I call Skeptical Believing: Possibilities for Knowing the God You're Not Sure Exists. And it's really trying to make very much the same kind of point about the fact that faith and doubt always coexist and are necessary ingredients in our life. They are ingredients in our life, whether we recognize them or not. And I appreciate what you've just shared. I do want people to hear, Maui, about what happens. You do graduate from Harvard. You do get this special scholarship. It does become the seedbed for your first company. You've now had successful companies and sold companies. I want to also have time for us to talk about the new venture that you're doing. But the reason I wanted to spend so much time exploring some of the pieces that we have already is that you now go on to land your work really in social emotional learning, which feels like nothing could be more obvious in one sense, but also could have been completely denied, right? I mean, you could have just pressed on, but instead, the very stuff that you have just so beautifully described actually becomes the stuff out of which this compelling, passionate commitment to children's social emotional development emerges as your whole career and your creativity and imagination and entrepreneurship and innovation. All of these things are all brought together in that. But tell us about that journey, and then about your first primary company, which was really all about that, and so is your current venture. So bring us up to speed as that story continues on.
Yeah, definitely. There was a student speaker, another speaker at my Harvard graduation, who said something. He had a line that said, "Here at Harvard, we go into every field known to man, everything from investment to banking." You like that, don't you, Mark? Because they all want to be iBankers at Goldman. Even the guy who was doing community service at the homeless shelter, now when graduation comes, everyone wants to work at McKinsey & Company. Everyone wants to work at Goldman. Everyone wants to work in private equity. Put yourself in my situation for a second, Mark. I'm the oldest, and when I go home, I'm still going to Section 8 housing.
Right.
So it's very difficult for me to not go into a traditional field, like that's guaranteed to make money. I now have the golden ticket, where if I just play by the rules, I'm going to have some level of financial abundance.
Right.
And remember when I told you, like, deep down, like, I've listened to that voice sometimes, I'm grateful to God for guiding me in these ways. And I knew that wasn't my path. I knew that I had experienced something. You gotta understand something. When I was in 8th grade, I had C's and D's in some classes. I had very little confidence. I really felt like I was below other people. I felt I was an ugly human being physically. I learned to kind of not see any beauty in myself. I really did view myself as that beetle in my book of Beetles and Angels. And to go on that kind of incredible journey where I realized, wait, none of that's true. That was all a bunch of garbage that I believed. I was able to do much better than I thought. I have value. I'm not this ugly kid who is unlovable or who is below other people. And yet millions of kids in our country, I knew, never found out what I got to find out, who they really were, what they could be. A large part of that, much of that was given to me through my faith. I wanted to give that to all kids and to give them that strength-based vision of who they were, that no matter where you come from, no matter what challenges your family has, no matter how you feel about yourself, there are incredible things that are possible for you in your life. And I'm going to show you how. I'm not just going to tell you. We're going to get into goal setting. We're going to get into methods for overcoming challenges. We're going to get to growth mindset. We're going to get into all these research-proven tools. So I jumped right in. I went back to my high school. I was blessed in high school. It's amazing how just one teacher can have such a profound impact. I had a teacher named Dr. Langlis, who's no longer alive. He passed away of cancer. But somehow I had him 3 years in a row. This guy was like an 8th degree black belt in Taekwondo. Incredible man. So I just went back to him and I said, hey, can I volunteer in your classroom? I don't know how to do this, but I want to help kids. That was my start. I just went back to my high school, started working with these kids, worked temp jobs. And then one of the things that I believe is that God hits a moving target. I truly believe that when we step out into things and take action, there's a series of events that can't be described or understood that happen. And that's what happened. Very quickly, I had some mentors who helped me understand how to do this work a little bit better. I got on the Oprah show. I got a 2-book mega deal with Little Brown and Company to write 2 books that have done really well for them. And all of a sudden, I was able to do this work all over the country, where I'm speaking, I'm writing, and Mark, it felt like I'd won the lottery. Not because I had all of a sudden had all this money or anything like that, but because I was getting to do something I really cared about, that I felt like had profound impact, and work that I was born to do, that I can uniquely do, that I could tell a kid, I know you got some challenges. I've been in a refugee camp. I know what it's like to lose my best friend. Don't lose hope. Like I've gone through a lot of that stuff. Like, here's some things you can do. If you feel like you can't do anything, well, here's how you get started. Okay.
Right.
If you feel like you don't have any friends, I've been there. And over time, I got a huge body of students, research studies that were done. And then my biggest break in terms of business, like actually building a business that was bigger than me. Because what happens, Mark, unfortunately, is the more well-known you become, everyone wants you to speak. Everyone wants you to write. You become a bottleneck. So one of my customers became for speaking. I keynoted actually, before I say that, let me just say for anyone who actually just wants to help kids and make a difference in kids' lives. One of the most important things I learned, Mark, is the best way to help kids is to help the adults in their lives.
Yes.
So at the beginning, I was speaking 99% to the kids. By the time, even to this day now, I only speak to the adults, to the educators, to the parents.
Right.
We create the oxygen the kids breathe in, the mindsets, the beliefs.
Right.
And so I was doing a professional development keynote to about 2,000 teachers at an online school. Florida Virtual School, the biggest online school in the world. They had hundreds of thousands of students. I developed a great friendship with their CEO named Julie Young. And I created a class with them. They ran a data study on that class that showed tremendous gains for the students that hired an outside company. We won a huge EdTech award for that. And once I saw that it was possible to use technology to take my work and help so many more kids, we became an educational technology company, EdTech company. And I grew that company, especially between 2016 and 19. We grew very quickly. And then I sold that to ACT, the assessment company, which I always thought was amazing because I didn't know what the ACT really was until I took it. I remember taking it at the high school nearby and being like, what is this test? And then years later, I'm the chief advisor on social emotional learning to the CEO of ACT and the board. And they bring me in. I'm like, wow, that's crazy, right? It's just unbelievable, right?
Right.
And so I'm like now helping them with their strategy in the 100 countries they operate in, which as an international person brings me so much joy, right?
Absolutely.
So I do that incredible run, lots of ups and downs, but I can truly say, Mark, I feel lucky because I've gotten to do something I really care about. Yes. And I think that I am uniquely wired to do well. And that's been one of the greatest joys God has given me in my life, to be able to do that.
It's really such a convergence of the deep, almost pre-verbal realities that you had experienced, then your own cultivation of that, all this journaling that you've done and still do, this sense of key people along the way, doors that open that are exceptional doors, and then living into that in both the pain and the harvest, really, of both that comes from pain as well as from things going as well as they did. And then launching in this way, it must have been so counterintuitive to be going to your parents' home and then to your local high school where you had gone when your friends are zooming off to Goldman. I mean, the pressure of that must have been remarkable. But then this speaking, writing reality, then this company, and then that gets eventually sold. You spend some time trying to understand what the next step is. And I do want people to hear about the company that you've more recently started called Inner Heroes Universe. It's really a remarkable thing. And I love the way that the whole venture gets started through Pixar. So tell us about that.
Yeah, definitely. And just 30 seconds real quick before I jump into that, you're absolutely right. It turns out all the things that were particularly hard or different ended up being the building blocks. So one of our most popular courses was the first social emotional learning class ever created for English learners. We taught them how not to be ashamed of who they were. So all that pain, I think that's one of the things that I'm sure even Fuller aspires to, is to take all that pain and the things that maybe people were ashamed of or thought or were told this is not good about who you are, but recognize the beauty in that and convert that into growth for everybody has been a lot of fun. So I still remember when I came to this country, one of the most magical moments when I came was I saw an Atari for the first time. Keep in mind, you had no electronics, and now I'm like, what? It was just a Pong game? And I went to a kid's house. It was one of the greatest things I ever saw in America, okay? And I still love video games. I play video games like crazy, but I've always loved media. I've always loved, and I was drawn to it as a kid. A lot of people would say video games are terrible. I knew how computers worked really well because I played a lot of video games as a low-income kid. I would be copying DOS files, whatever it was, from different computers. And so I've always had a love for media. And I saw this movie, Inside Out, by Pixar about 7 or 8 years ago when it came out 10 years ago. And I know you are familiar with that studio, and Pete Docter, who you connected me with. But when I saw this movie, it blew my mind because it did something I had always aspired to, but I never knew how to do. And even when I had done my trainings with youth, I always used metaphors. Instead of saying, here's the principles of agency and locus of control, I would tell kids, hit your turbo button. You have a turbo button in your heart. Like, you hit your turbo button, don't hit the freeze button, hit the turbo button. I always look for ways to make the abstract concrete, the invisible visible. And I think that's part of the artistry and fun when you do this work, is to be imaginative. So here comes along this movie, and it's converted our inner world into these incredible characters of joy. There's a character named Joy that's resplendent and glowing. There's a character, Anger. And for those of you who haven't watched the movie, please watch it. Inside Out 2. I'm going to do the plug. It's coming out June 14.
Exactly.
Very excited to watch that. Very excited to watch that. But what this movie did in a way that had never been done before is it personified our inner world into characters. And it told a story where you saw the external journey of this girl and her challenges, but then you saw her emotional headquarters and what light looks like on the inside. And all those years journaling, all those years kind of thinking about metaphors, it all came together. As soon as I saw it, I knew when I was done with Maui Learning, this is what I was going to do. I want to bring the inner world to life using art, media, storytelling in a way that Pixar has pioneered, and they're done a great job with emotions. I feel we can go way beyond emotions. We can create an entirely rich universe. And the reason it matters right now, Mark, more than ever before, is that a big part of it is just me being a dad of kids ages 3 to 15. They don't live in the world of self-help books. They don't live in the world of curriculum, even though my curriculum was good. They live in the world of media.
Yes.
Like, they live in the world of phones. They live in the world of vivid characters, like the Inside Out characters. So I believe to reach the next generation, it's not going to work to try to convince them to do less media and to do things the way we had it the old way. We have to go to where they are and create rich, compelling, awesome media that grabs their attention and shows them the fullness of who they are internally as vividly as anything in the external world. And I think, and that's what we're doing. We're starting off with books right now. We're having a lot of fun with that. We've already released our first 4 books. We're going to release the next 4.
Which I really love, by the way.
Thank you so much. We're going to release the next 4. And then from there, I want to get into building it out through all the rest of media, video games, everything else. And to basically imagine if you could only communicate positive psychology using art and storytelling. And you couldn't be didactic. And you had to use imagination and creativity. Right. To me, that's fun. That's exciting. That's something we can give kids, right? So that's what that, and I want to thank you, Mark, because you've been a great thought partner on that, and it's been fun. I appreciate you connecting me with a couple folks too on that venture.
Well, I think it's so compelling, and especially because in my case, having the privilege of knowing you and seeing all this really always through the eyes of your background, which feels like a great instance of harvesting pain, of harvesting joy, of harvesting deep cultural difference, of harvesting challenging childhood experiences, but also great breakthroughs and transitions and insights and it's just it's a remarkable story. Brings me back to where we started when I said it just feels like you're sort of oceans of things that involve this spectrum from the truly tragic and sad and horrific realities of the world to really some pretty extraordinary achievements, but more profoundly than that along the way, as you've so beautifully illustrated, this continuous harvesting of what all of that brings you for the sake of someone beyond you, namely, in this case, children, your own children, but also all the children that are being affected by what you have produced in the past, but what you are now producing. It is like a unicorn story, Maui, and I don't use that glibly. I do really feel as though there's been something very special that God has given you. You've received everything that has included, and you've sought to bring it forward in a way that can truly manifest itself in changing lives, which I know is in the long arc one of your great hopes for all that you're doing. So, Maui, this has just been so fun to talk to you, and I really bless you. I thank you for what you're doing, who you are, and I'm eager for seeing how this story continues to unfold.
Mark, thank you so much for your kind words and for your encouragement. I've really enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.